Can I hold the baby too? Tears streaming down my face, I asked as I looked at the newborn baby. Then, Susan and Mark looked at each other and began to laugh. What are you saying? Something so silly. You don't have to ask to hold the baby, just do it. Thinking they would say that, I approached the baby when suddenly. Hey, don't come any closer, Susan said, laughing. I thought I misheard, but I hadn't. Why should I let a stranger like you touch my child? A stranger? Mark also looked at me and laughed. We have no use for you anymore. He spat the words at me. Unable to say anything, I just stood there frozen as they laughed together. Were all those days a lie? Was I the only one who thought we were happily living together as three? It felt like everything was going dark. No. We had a great time. You earned a lot, supported us, right? Yeah. We lived luxuriously, and you always did what we asked, right? There was no love or gratitude for me in their words. I had been deceived for over 20 years. I couldn't help but laugh at my own foolishness. Shaking with laughter, I laughed. Has she finally gone mad? Mark looked at me with a sneering, contemptuous face. Why did I ever love such a man? That's disgusting. What? I had a feeling it would be like this. Susan and Mark looked dumbfounded. I headed towards the door at the back. As I opened the door, they froze. I'm Elizabeth Johnson, 53 years old. Living with my husband and daughter. At first glance, you might think we're just an ordinary family. But our case is a bit different. My daughter is not my biological child. She's my husband's daughter from a previous relationship. Before meeting my husband, I was married to another man but got divorced due to infertility. Of course, it was an amicable divorce after mutual discussion. After realizing I couldn't have children, I threw myself into work. Work was my only sustenance. Before I knew it, I had become the rising star at my company. That's when I met Mark, who would become my husband. He was working for a client company, the same age as me, and a kind man. I first met him when I visited his company for a meeting, and my heel broke. He helped me, and that was how we met. After that, we greeted each other whenever we saw one another, gradually started talking more, and I found myself looking forward to meeting Mark. Once when I visited Mark's office, I saw a little girl, about 3 years old, in the office. Curious, I asked the receptionist who was helping me, and she said the girl's name was Susan, Mark's daughter. Susan was born not long before her mother passed away. Since then, Mark had been raising her alone, juggling work and fatherhood. Sometimes, when Susan couldn't go to daycare due to a fever or something, she'd wait here in the office. There was a cooling patch on Susan's forehead. Just then, Mark returned to the office. Hey, Elizabeth. Are you here for another meeting? He greeted me warmly. Yes, that's right. I imagined all the unseen struggles Mark must have faced. I heard about your daughter. Mark looked surprised, but quickly smiled again. Ah, yes, she sometimes comes here. The daycare won't take her even with a slight fever. I see. Please don't mind me, go home and let her rest. Raising a child must be incredibly hard, something I, childless, couldn't even imagine. Right. See you then. Saying this, Mark picked up Susan and left the office. Even during the meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about Mark and Susan. There are many single parents out there, each with their own struggles. Surely, every family has its own set of struggles and challenges. And of course, even in families where both parents are present, it doesn't mean there are no hardships. I, unable to have children, would never know such struggles in my lifetime. Suddenly, dedicating my life to work felt lonely. I wondered if there was anything I could do to lessen Mark's burden. Unbeknownst to me, my heart had already been stolen by Mark. Since then, I sought more opportunities to talk to Mark. Exchanging contact information and going out for meals with Susan didn't take long. Susan grew fond of me, and the three of us started spending more time together. When Susan turned 4, she casually said, "I want to eat Elizabeth's cooking every day." Her words drove my feelings. Mark, a bit embarrassed, scolded her. Now, Susan. Elizabeth is busy, don't make unreasonable requests. But what was he really thinking? A few days later, while at the park with them, I asked Mark. I was really happy about what Susan said the other day. Mark looked puzzled, not sure what I was referring to. If it's okay with you, shall I cook daily? Mark's face lit up. Was that unclear? I mean, I'd like to be with you and… Before I could finish, Mark interrupted me. Wait, please. I felt a sudden jolt of anxiety. Mark gazed at Susan playing on the playground equipment and let out a sigh. Did I overstep my bounds? A wave of uncertainty washed over me. Can't add more to your burden. Mark muttered. Was it a no, then? How about we share the household chores? I was taken aback. What? I mean, since you're busy with work too, I should take on some of the chores. Does this mean? Could I be misunderstanding? You want to marry me? Oh, right. Sorry, yes. I mean, no, not like that. Mark was flustered but then stood up straight, facing me. Sorry for being unclear. Will you marry me, despite everything? Yes. I answered with a beaming smile. Susan's voice calling for Mark echoed in the distance. Yet, we stood there, hand in hand, looking into each other's eyes. 20 years have passed since that day. We became a family and have lived together ever since. Susan, who was 4 then, is now 24. And I'm still working, as always. I had an inheritance left by my late parents, but more than anything, I wanted to do something for Susan, who loved me like her real mother. Even when I was busy with work, Mark and Susan never complained and helped around the house. But, following Susan's wish, I made sure to prepare at least one meal a day, as she had said she wanted to eat my cooking every day. From her daycare graduation to finishing college, I tried to fulfill her wishes as much as possible. School events, extracurricular activities, tutoring, I let her do what she wanted, just like other kids. Susan grew up well-behaved, and 2 years ago, she graduated from college and is now working for a local company. Now, all that's left is for her to find someone good and get married. Lately, I've felt more and more like a full-fledged mother. Contrary to my feelings, Susan's attitude towards me seemed cold since she started working. The first time I felt something was wrong was when she stopped eating the meals I prepared. Once or twice might have been okay, but she started eating out every time I cooked. Confused, I consulted with Mark, but he brushed it off lightly, saying, Susan is working now, a full-fledged adult. It's not something to worry about so much. Indeed, that's true. She's an adult now, and I shouldn't interfere too much. That's what I thought at the time, but then Susan stopped eating my meals entirely. Her coldness wasn't limited to meals. We haven't had a real conversation in a long time. Both of us working with different schedules contributed to that, but even in the brief mornings when we saw each other, she acted as if I wasn't there. She wouldn't respond or react to anything I said. One night, when I was eating a late dinner after returning home, Susan came back. Welcome home, Susan. I was just eating. Shall I make you something light? I tried speaking up, but Susan just sighed heavily and retreated to her room without a word. Did I unknowingly hurt Susan? Feeling anxious, I talked to Mark again, but he dismissed it, saying maybe Susan's just tired from her new job. Despite Susan's cold behavior, I never changed my attitude. Whatever happened, I believed we would eventually return to how we used to be. Blood-related or not, Susan was my daughter. Though days of being ignored and treated coldly continued, I never gave up on talking to Susan every day. Time passed. How long has it been since Susan and I last spoke? Yet, I kept greeting her as usual. Good morning. Have a great day at work. Bye. I watched her leave without touching the breakfast I made, silent. How long will these days continue? I might be reaching my limit. With these thoughts, I headed to work. Over the years, none of my colleagues could give me a satisfactory answer, dismissing it as a delayed rebellious phase or just a phase people go through. Eventually, I stopped consulting anyone and kept worrying alone. Returning home became a source of dread, especially on days when I could leave work on time. Unable to shake off my heavy mood, I would buy ingredients for dinner. "I'm home." "Hey, welcome back." Mark was already home, watching the evening news, and had opened a beer. "Maybe I'll have a drink too today," I said, opening the fridge to grab a beer. "What's up? That's rare for you." Talking to Mark about my feelings would only lead to him evading the topic again. "Just once in a while. Days like these happen." "Right." The conversation ended there. If this continues, not only with Susan but also with Mark, our conversations might disappear. I felt overwhelmed by anxiety again. Had I not chosen to become a family with Mark and Susan, would I have avoided these feelings? I caught myself thinking that and quickly stopped. "No, don't think about it anymore," I told myself, taking a deep breath to dispel the anxiety. "I'm home." It sounded like Susan had returned. As she passed through the kitchen and headed to the living room, I called out to her. "Welcome back, Susan. You're early today." "I'm just about to get dinner ready, hang on for a bit, okay?" I expected to be ignored, as usual, but I reminded myself not to give in, not to flinch, to behave as I always do. It was like chanting a spell in my mind. Susan let out a heavy sigh. "Yeah." Her voice was small, but she responded. "What?" "Oh, yeah, just wait a minute." I couldn't hide my surprise. But whether she noticed my reaction or not, Susan just watched TV with Mark. I was so happy I almost burst into song. I regretted not preparing her favorite dishes for dinner as I continued with the preparations. That night, for the first time in years, Susan ate a meal I cooked. Just that alone lifted my spirits as if all the past troubles were a lie. But the good news wasn't just that. During dinner, Susan opened up about someone she wanted us to meet. It was the best day I've had in a long time. For the first time in a while, I slept soundly through the night. The man Susan introduced was wealthier than Mark and I could have imagined. His name was Stephen Young, 4 years older than Susan, and his parents worked for one of the major corporations. He was supposed to work in the same company as his parents, but not wanting to rely on connections, he sought employment on his own and ended up working at the same company as Susan. Susan and Stephen were in the same department at work, and it seems he was drawn to her carefree personality. "I just can't leave her alone, you know?" Raised as an elite from a young age, Stephen probably never met someone like Susan before. It's odd for me to say, but Susan doesn't have a competitive spirit. She's laid back, to say the least. Even through my eyes, she's always been a bit of a dreamer. In a harsh world where everyone is compared and striving to be the best, I understood why Stephen was attracted to her, having lived in that world myself when work was everything. Seeing him sitting next to Susan, blushing slightly, I felt relieved. Even though his parents were wealthy, Stephen himself was just an ordinary young man. Straightforward, without any biased thoughts. I was looking forward to meeting his parents. On the day our families met, Stephen's parents came all the way from New York to our town. Stephen had arranged the meeting at the most prestigious hotel restaurant in town. I sometimes used it for business entertainment, but Mark and Susan were clearly nervous. Well, it's a big deal, discussing our daughter's marriage. Their tension was more than just being in an unfamiliar place. And there I was, somehow calm. Why, I wondered. I think of Susan as my own daughter. Seeing their nervousness, I unconsciously thought I shouldn't get caught up in it too. As I analyzed this, Stephen and his parents arrived. "Thank you for coming on such a fine day," Mark began with a shaky voice. "Thank you for coming all this way to our little town." I spoke up as Mark stumbled over his words. "Oh, please, no need to be so formal. Today, we are just parents enjoying a meal together." Stephen's father had a warm and approachable demeanor, and his mother smiled gently by his side. "We were really looking forward to meeting Susan and her parents today. She must be about our age, but still had a youthful grace about her. This must be the demeanor of the upper class. Caught up in the moment, I almost forgot I was a parent and responded after snapping back to reality.
Really, our daughter isn't anything special, but Stephen seems to like her easygoing nature. As for Stephen here, he's always been rebellious with me. Bringing home such a gentle woman, I had to reassess my view of him.
After some initial greetings, we all sat down and a lavish meal was served. Susan and Mark seemed to relax a bit as they saw the fancy dishes. By the time the champagne for the toast was empty, we were all engaged in pleasant conversation. I was initially on guard, thinking they were from the upper class, but the more we talked, the more we got along. Turns out, Stephen's father wasn't born wealthy. We talked about our younger days, hobbies, and recent interests, with our generation's topics dominating the conversation, leaving the young couple blinking in surprise. Before we knew it, the main course was over, and dessert and coffee were served. The meeting ended on a cheerful note. I exchanged contact details with Stephen's mother, and we even became close enough to go out for lunch together sometimes. A few months later, Stephen and Susan had a grand wedding and started living in a condo near our house. A year later, we were overjoyed to learn that Susan was pregnant. She quit her job without hesitation and started visiting our house frequently. She spent more time at our place than in her new home with Stephen. Sometimes, I suggested she spend more time at home with Stephen, but she would cling to me, saying, "Stephen's always at work. And I'm not feeling very well. And I can eat your cooking," she'd say, making it impossible for me to send her away. Before I knew it, I was not only cooking for her but also cleaning their new home and driving her around for errands. As a mother, I thought I should be there for my daughter during tough times. However, I was a bit concerned about her always being on her phone and occasionally going out abruptly. One day, Stephen came to our house with Susan. Seeing her lying on the sofa, constantly on her smartphone as usual, he said, "Susan, how about you do something for yourself once in a while? Your mother must be tired from work too." But Susan dismissed him, saying, "It's okay. Elizabeth loves doing this for me. She does it for me."
Elizabeth, I'm really sorry for all the meals you prepare in advance,
Stephen said, apologizing to me when he saw that Susan's behavior wasn't changing. Stephen really is a good young man.
Well, it can't be helped. I helped raise Susan, after all. You don't need to apologize, Stephen. Besides, things will surely change once the baby is born,
I said, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring Stephen or myself. Months later, Susan finally gave birth. I was with her from the moment her labor began, contacting Stephen, his parents, and Mark. Stephen was with her in the delivery room for the birth. I was on edge the entire time. Having never experienced childbirth myself, I couldn't even imagine what kind of pain she was going through. Stephen's mother joined me in prayer. The birth went smoothly, and soon Susan and the baby were both looking healthy. I was so moved, tears flowed freely. I couldn't wait to hold the baby. But I learned that I wouldn't be able to hold the baby until the next day, so we left Stephen at the hospital and planned to return the next day. The following day, when we visited Susan's room, there was the newborn baby, sleeping in the crib. Seeing a newborn up close for the first time, I was moved to tears again.
I can't wait to hold you in my arms.
Just as I let out my true feelings, the baby started crying with a faint voice. We were asked to leave the room for breastfeeding.
Stephen will be finishing up work and coming here soon. I'll go pick him up and buy some cake on the way,
said Stephen's mother as she left the hospital. Hearing Susan's voice calling from the room, Mark and I re-entered. This time I was sure I could hold the baby. Thinking that, I decided to check with Susan.
Can I hold the baby too?
Then Susan and Mark looked at each other, burst into laughter, and started laughing.
What are you saying? Something so silly. You don't have to ask to hold the baby, just do it.
Thinking they would say that, I approached Susan and the baby when,
"Hey, don't come any closer,"
Susan said, laughing.
What?
I thought I misheard, but I hadn't.
Why should I let a stranger like you touch my child and Steven's child?
A stranger. I looked at Mark, searching for support.
Has the time finally come?
Mark also looked at me and laughed.
Susan found herself a better cash cow than you. And she's given birth to his child.
Was this really the same man I had spent all these years with? His face seemed so distorted.
We have no use for you anymore.
He threw the words at me like venom. I stood frozen, unable to respond, as Susan added insult to injury.
Really, I've always hated pandering to you since I was little. And you, always happy because you got everything you wanted.
Mark joined in their laughter.
Were all those days a lie? Was I the only one who thought we were happily living together as three?
My voice trembled. Everything seemed to turn dark before my eyes.
No. I had fun. You made a lot of money and supported us, right? Yeah. We lived luxuriously, and you always did what we wanted, right?
There was no love or gratitude for me in their words. Just a sense of treating me like a convenient tool, devoid of any compassion.
Well, you did keep nagging like a mother. Really, what were you thinking? We're the ones who let you keep believing that illusion. We've been pretending to be a family for years. Maybe we have a talent for acting?
Again, they both burst into laughter. I could feel my emotions draining away. I had been deceived for over 20 years. I couldn't help but laugh at my own foolishness. Shaking with laughter, I laughed. Mark and Susan looked at me as if I were something strange.
Has she finally gone mad?
Mark watched me with a sneering, contemptuous face. Why did I ever love such a man?
That's disgusting. What?
For the first time, Mark was taken aback by words of scorn directed at him.
I had a feeling it would be like this.
Mark and Susan looked dumbfounded.
Did you know there were others listening to this conversation?
I headed towards the back door. Mark and Susan still didn't seem to grasp the situation. As I opened the door, they froze. There stood Stephen and his mother. Mark and Susan's faces turned pale. In contrast, Stephen and his mother's faces were red with anger. Their expressions harsh. Then Stephen slowly approached Susan, holding a large envelope in his hand.
What's this about?
Pressured by Stephen's intensity, Susan tried to stand her ground.
I'll ask you straight. Susan, is that child really mine?
Stephen looked at the baby sleeping in the crib. Susan's expression flickered for a moment.
What are you talking about? Of course it is.
Her blinking increased. Stephen silently handed her the envelope.
What's this?
Susan hesitantly checked the contents of the envelope and was speechless.
What's wrong?
Mark went next to Susan, took the papers from her hand. And he too was lost for words.
I'll get a DNA test done for this child,
said Stephen, picking up the papers that Mark had dropped.
It's a mistake.
Susan desperately appealed to Stephen, but he seemed unmoved.
There's a very capable lawyer friend of my husband. This evidence is irrefutable,
said Stephen's mother, her voice chillingly cold despite her delicate appearance.
Why has it come to this? Susan!
Mark seemed unaware of Susan's infidelity. The documents Stephen brought were evidence of Susan's affair and papers related to divorce discussions.
It's a mistake.
Susan's voice was now a weak murmur, repeating the same words.
If it is a mistake, let's clarify it with the test.
There was a hint of warmth in Stephen's eyes, perhaps still wanting to believe in Susan.
Elizabeth, thank you for everything.
Leaving Mark behind, we left the hospital room.
It's all right. Whenever Susan was acting strange, I knew something was up.
I was the first to suspect Susan's infidelity. During her pregnancy, she often came to our house, constantly on her smartphone. Once, I accidentally saw the screen. It looked like a messaging app, with texts about meeting up. And then Susan would leave suddenly. Stephen was supposed to be at work, and something about it didn't sit right with me. Around that time, Stephen had casually mentioned to me that Susan was acting distant. I had reassured him it might just be emotional instability common during pregnancy. My suspicions were just that, suspicions, not solid proof. They were only dots that couldn't be connected yet. They were not enough to confront Susan. Stephen had started his own investigation. The results indicated the possibility of Susan's affair and that the child might not be his. By then, Susan was already in her final month of pregnancy. When Stephen told me, I shared my suspicions. And I suggested a DNA test after the birth to confirm the truth.
I really did something unforgivable. Despite being deceived, the fact that I raised that child as my own hasn't changed. There's no way I can apologize enough,
I said, apologizing to Stephen and his mother. Even though I had been deceived, it was a family issue after living together for over 20 years. It wasn't something only I could be forgiven for. Yet, Stephen's mother casually said, "What are you talking about, Elizabeth? Those two are the real culprits, aren't they? You're a victim too. Maybe we should consult the lawyer we used this time?" She said it with a childlike laugh. I realized this was one person I should never make an enemy of. I was grateful to have found such a strong ally. A few days later, the DNA test results came back. The child was not Stephen's. Stephen filed for divorce, but Susan refused to accept it, leading to mediation. Susan started to try to charm me again, but I no longer entertained her. In fact, I was so fed up with living in the same house that I quickly made arrangements to move out. Both Stephen and I were astounded by Susan's audacity to refuse the divorce during mediation, but it was clear she would lose the lawsuit. Adultery, physical relationships, and cuckolding during marriage are not condoned, and we even had the DNA test results. Susan was demanded to pay alimony, not only for herself but also for her college student lover, who had fled and refused to take responsibility for the child. As a result, Susan had to pay the alimony for both herself and her lover. Moreover, Susan couldn't rely on Mark either. Unknown to me, Mark had quit his job while living off my earnings, and had even accumulated gambling debts. I learned about this mess from Mark's mother after I had moved during Susan's ongoing divorce proceedings. Of course, I had already filed for divorce from Mark, with the process facilitated by the lawyer introduced by Stephen's father. Still, both Susan and Mark seemed to be trying to cling to me, but everyone around me knew what they had done and was supportive of me. So far, there have been no assaults from them. As for the baby, Mark's parents decided to take custody. Living in the countryside, they declared their intention to sever ties with both Mark and Susan upon learning of the scandal. If Mark and Susan tried to rely on them, the close-knit community wouldn't allow it. The connections in the countryside are often stronger than even those among relatives. Mark's parents felt that the baby itself wasn't to blame and decided to take care of it, although I was hesitant to leave the baby with them, considering their age. I also felt responsible, having raised Susan until she was an adult, and receiving much help during my marriage to Mark. I decided to assist with the child's education expenses. When I mentioned this to Stephen's mother, she said, "Well, if that's what you think, Elizabeth," and prepared a substantial sum.
No, I can't accept this.
But she insisted, "It's all right. Think of it as severance money from Stephen and that girl," and smiled innocently. Turns out her family was wealthy, something I hadn't known at the time of our first meeting. She was the daughter of the president of the company Stephen's father worked for.
Oh, didn't I mention it? Besides, this is one of the few joys I have.
Her gaze sent a chill down my spine. She's truly a frightening person. I was grateful for being in her good graces and becoming friends. Several years later, Mark and Susan were still plagued by debt. As for me, I was off to lunch with Stephen's mother.
"Elizabeth."
Her voice, always like a young girl's, called out to me. Beside her stood Stephen and a younger woman, seemingly finding his new happiness. I waved and hurried over to join them.